with a political stream. Today what we're going to be talking about or watching is the Intelligence Squared debate. It was done a few years ago, and the debate question is the constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. And throughout this video I'm going to be making commentary on my thoughts on the debate and also just my general thoughts on gun control and the Second Amendment in general. So here goes nothing. We're about to get the opening statement.
You're a professor of law as well as professor of government at the University of Texas, Austin. Actually, I'm repeating myself. So, Sanford, I'm going to give you one more great big backup roundup, and we're just going to keep going. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to arguing for the motion, Sanford Levinson.
Thank you. I want to begin by repeating a point that Bob Rosencrantz made. This is not a debate about policy. As it happens, I can't completely speak for my colleague, Professor Dershowitz, but I would very much oppose, for example, a federal law banning guns independently of the Second Amendment, because it is very, very clear that there is a critical mass of Americans who would be vehemently opposed to that. It would just add to the divisions in the country, and it would increase the number of criminals in the country.
Okay, I want to say first and foremost, I agree with that 100%. I think that just banning all guns, not the best way to go about it for the reasons he's outlining here. So for all of you people that call me a gun grabber, it's not true. If I say during my stream, #grab those guns, it's mostly a joke just to piss off all the conservative snowflakes out there. So yes, I do not agree with a full-on ban.
Because just as with drug laws and gambling laws and the like, there is no reason to believe that such a law could genuinely be enforced. Most enforcement requires a willingness to comply with a law that one regards as relatively legitimate, and this law would not be regarded, I think, in that capacity. It's also true with regard to a number of other gun control statutes that are proposed that I have distinctly mixed feelings about, many of them on a variety of policy grounds, but fortunately we're not here to debate that. Nor do I think we are here to debate the one true meaning of the Second Amendment, as interesting as that topic is, and about which indeed I have written. Rather, I want to emphasize the topic that is in front of us. The constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. Now, one reason I relish this statement of the question is that I'm one of those relatively rare people, I will admit, who actually believe there should be a new constitutional convention, because I believe that a number of provisions of the Constitution have outlived their usefulness. I wouldn't...
Yes, 100% yes. There's quite a few pieces in the Constitution that have outlived their usefulness or are just completely archaic. Like the amendment, I think it's the Third Amendment, that prevents you from having to quarter soldiers. I don't think that's something we need to worry about in 2020.
Even say that the Second Amendment, or the right to bear arms, is the one that has most outlived its usefulness. But I'm really quite happy to argue that in 2013, the kinds of considerations that led to the placement of the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which Bob Rosencrantz summarized, I think, very well, have outlived their usefulness. So if we were going to have a debate in 2013 about what substantive rights, as well as what structures, the Senate, bicameralism, presidential veto, and stuff like that, what would a 2013 or 2015 Constitution look like? Would it include a substantive right in the United States Constitution to bear arms? And I would argue that the answer is no. Let me also emphasize that this is a different question from whether state constitutions should include a right to bear arms. Eugene has written one of the definitive articles showing, I don't know what the current number is, but I think it's over 40 state constitutions do protect a right to bear arms. And that raises a very, very important question of whether we need to have that in the United States Constitution as well. Let me give you two principal reasons why a constitutionalized right to bear arms, instead of a right to bear arms that would simply be fought out in the political process, and all of us know that the political process today is tilted either legitimately or illegitimately. That's the topic of yet another debate that we need not have this evening, generally in favor of the rights of gun owners. So let me give you the two reasons why I think the Second Amendment has outlived its usefulness in the 21st century. The first reason is precisely that it is anti-federal. That is to say, one of the anomalies, sometimes it's very difficult to tell the players without a scorecard,
Where's
in
he going
the
with
debate
that?
about gun rights. There are many, many people who define themselves as conservatives who rail against a rampaging national government that believes in one-size-fits-all solutions to national problems. Well, this is not necessarily what Heller decides, but it is what the Supreme Court decided 2 years later in the McDonald case, where it held that every state in the Union has to toe a single line. Louis Brandeis spoke very eloquently of states as little laboratories of experimentation. Most states have chosen to experiment in favor of gun rights. There are some states or cities, very dense cities like Washington, D.C., that would prefer different experiments. Or in New York itself, one can well imagine a particular policy for the great cities of New York and a very different policy for upstate New York, where there are far, far more hunters than is the case in Manhattan, say. And one of the things that a single national constitutional amendment, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, does is to stifle that kind of federalism, and I think that's a mistake. But there's a second real problem with constitutionalizing the right to bear arms in the 21st century. As Mr. Rosencrantz suggested, the right to bear arms, or the Second Amendment, had a kind of cosmetic value until 2008. It's not that people didn't write about it. I wrote about it, Eugene wrote about it, a number of people found it very interesting, but it played remarkably little role in actual American law. Beginning with Heller, it does play a role. But what does that mean? It means that you turn over decision-making power to a group of federal judges who are highly divided, who have no expertise in this area, and who make often quite remarkable, even unreasoned distinctions. Thus, for example, in Heller,
And this is where it gets interesting with our own federal government, is that he's making a great point that judges now are making the call on key issues, such as whether or not you're going to be able to have a gun in your home or not, or having certain types of guns. And that's a problem. That's a big, big problem, and we need to solve it together as one nation, but we also, as he spoke to, need to solve it together as our own states or our own municipalities. And I think this is what's kind of dividing the country at the moment, especially where I live in California. There's quite a lot of conservative people that just hate where they live in California only because of the liberal laws that are being passed. And I think the thing that I always encourage people to do is just pack up and move. If you don't like where you're going, just pack up and move. Hello, collusion. A judge is only required to have expertise on the law. That's what a judge does, of course. But the challenge would be the fact that the way that case law is adjudicated is that they're now deciding so many minute things. Like, for instance, I used to be a use of force analyst, and one of the things that dictated how we judged use of force was a Supreme Court decision, and that Supreme Court decision had to outline the reasonable peace officer doctrine. So now one group of judges, only 5 out of 4, would actually have say on how police use force, and that's a big, big issue that has ramifications in daily life. But I do appreciate you chiming in on that, because I do think you do make a good point that they just interpret what the law says, but there's really minute ramifications there. So it's a challenging issue.
Justice Scalia says that Dick Heller is protected, which I think is a perfectly plausible argument, but he suggests that Martha Stewart is not, because she actually lied to an FBI agent and is thus a convicted felon. I don't think judges should be making those kinds of decisions. I think legislators should.
Thank you, Senator Levinson. Our motion is the constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness, and now here to try to persuade you to vote against this motion. Let's welcome Eugene Volokh. He is the Gary T. Schwartz Professor of Law at UCLA and founder and co-founder of the Volokh Conspiracy, one of the most widely read legal blogs in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, Eugene Volokh.
Thank you very much for having me here, and it's such a great pleasure to be on the same panel with David and Alan and Sandy. They're all top scholars, and I also reckon all of them as friends of mine. So let me start with something I think we all agree on the panel, and I think probably virtually everybody, perhaps everybody in the audience agrees on, too, and that is that there's a basic human right to self-defense. Now, there are, of course, debates about the particular boundaries of that right, but there's a core to that right that every state in the Union recognizes. I'm sure it's well recognized outside the U.S. as well. If somebody is threatening you with imminent death, serious injury, rape, kidnapping, you're entitled to use force, even deadly force, in order to defend yourself if that is necessary. That's very broadly agreed on, and I think it's agreed on because it is a basic human right. So I think there's little difference about that. But then there's the question, what
That's probably because of my speed. I keep speeding up the video. Sorry about that.
does that right entail? And I want to argue that a right to self-defense, like other rights, entails the right, at least presumptively, to have the tools that are necessary to reasonably, effectively defend yourself. Let's take an example. The right to control whether you want to reproduce, whether you want to have children or not. Imagine somebody says, oh, sure, I'm all for that right. You can use birth control so long as it's the rhythm method. We wouldn't say that's a serious argument. We'd say it's a parody of an argument. Right? We'd say, well, of course, the right to control your reproductive future involves the right to use tools that are reasonably necessary in order to effectively do that. That's not just for that right, it's also for speech. Your right to speak doesn't just mean the right to move your mouth, it's the right to use the internet, use various other technologies.
This is where the right kind of compounds the issue. They try to use simple arguments to try and get you to agree that you need to use any and all guns to defend yourself, trying to equate it to birth control here. The fact of the matter is gun control should be considered its own unique issue, its own unique boundaries, and its own unique, no analogy can really compare to what gun control or gun use is. It's its own animal.
That are reasonably
and the right
necessary
likes to do that a
defend
lot.
yourself. And guns are reasonably necessary to effectively defend yourself. Our own bodies,
That's
you know,
true.
we sometimes can defend ourselves with that, but not when our assailant is armed with a gun or otherwise. And even if unarmed, if the assailant is sufficiently big, sufficiently strong, sufficiently ruthless, the only way we can effectively defend ourselves in many situations is with a gun, often not by shooting it. The overwhelming majority of all defensive gun uses involve just threatening to use it. Just a couple of thought experiments. I'm sure some of you live in places, in houses where on the front
I'm still
lawn
torn
it
on
says
whether the defensive
protected
gun
by
use
armed
statistics are
patrol.
actually accurate
I
because
suspect
of the
few
whole
of you live in
notion
houses
that you know, oh, they threaten to use it. We don't know whether those stories are true. Those are just stories that people tell. So we just don't know how accurate those DGU numbers are. The right uses equative arguments because their actual literal argument is not very defensible. You're absolutely right, my friend. You're absolutely right, my friend.
front lawn it says protected by unarmed patrol. I would be willing to bet that. So in a sense, really,
You're absolutely right because I want to expand on that because every time you try and argue with someone on the right, they'll use such a analogy that doesn't make any sense. Like if you talk about, you know, Donald Trump lying, they'll go, well, don't you lie to your kids about Santa Claus? Oh, ho, 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 ho. Yeah, I lie to my kids about Santa Claus. That's way different than, hey, I didn't collude with Russia. Way different. My experience with talking to gun guys is that there are a lot of tall stories. Yes, you are absolutely right about that. People who are gun guys tend to have an inflated self-sense of who they are, and they tend to really, really build themselves up, and the gun just amplifies that. And, you know, they'll tell stories about how they diffused a road rage incident. We all know that's just a bunch of shit.
those people who have the money to have armed guards, either personal bodyguards or people driving by, are already entitled to essentially take advantage of this technology to defend themselves. The right to bear arms gives people the ability to do that even if they can't afford to hire someone, if they are their own armed guards. That's what the right to keep and bear arms allows people to do that. And I think it's no surprise then that 44 of the state constitutions specifically protect a right to bear arms, and over 40 of them clearly in a way that it's an individual right to bear arms. And this isn't just some weird anachronism. This dates back from the Pennsylvania Constitution in 1776 to the Kansas Constitution in, I think, 2012, and several constitutions in the preceding a couple of decades as well. Now, some people may say, well, okay, fine, it's reasonable to say there's a presumption in favor of being able to have tools needed to defend yourself, but maybe it should be rebuttable. If there's solid enough evidence that banning guns or seriously limiting guns would protect us so much that outweighs whatever loss to self-defense there may be, well, then we should do that. Well, interesting argument, but there is no such evidence. So in 2004,
Another argument the right likes to make is that there is no evidence that reducing the amount of guns decreases the amount of gun violence. It's absolutely true in every single country that they've ever tried it in, period.
The National Research Council appointed a committee of scholars, of criminologists. They put out this very nice report. You can read it for free online. The consensus was, based on the existing studies, there's no evidence that either extra gun ownership or extra gun restrictions would make people safer. Centers for Disease Control in 2005, similar study, similar result. The other studies.
The Center for Disease Control came out with a study in 1993 that showed that you're 25% more likely to use that gun on yourself and your family members than you ever would in any type of defensive situation. He conveniently left that part out.
As well, from New York's own New York.
He'll also leave out the part of well-regulated militia, the first 4 words of the Second Amendment.
University, James Jacobs' book says, can gun control work? His answer, not as an ideologue on this, is probably not, at least based on what we know. Now, of course, Sandy might say, all right, these are all interesting questions, but why do they need to be resolved as a constitutional matter by judges? Well, one reason might be that we do have a tradition of resolving, indeed on a national level, questions of basic human rights. As to free speech, as to searches and seizures, variety of other things, we have taken them off of the federalism process. We have set them up as human rights for the country as a whole, but still one could very reasonably ask this question as whether this makes sense. Well, I think the answer to that, you have to think practically, and you have to think about what is likely to be effective in our country given the political realities. And so for that, you have to ask yourself, what do you want? If you're interested in gun control, what is it that you want? Now, if what you want, so you might want...
Okay, here's what I want in terms of gun control. I don't want people to have access to weapons that are dangerous enough to where they can blow away 20 school children in a matter of seconds. I don't want people to have those types of weapons. And the weapons that are most capable of doing that are semi-automatic rifles with pistol grips and yeah, that's what I want. I don't want those guns around, and I also want to increase background checks so idiots don't get guns and people that shouldn't have them don't get guns. Plain and simple. I want to reduce the amount of bad people that get guns.
Gun bans or handgun bans. Or you might want modest gun controls, background checks, restrictions on mentally ill people, limits on size of large capacity magazines. You have to decide what is it that you want. Now, if you want the former, if you want total gun bans or handgun bans, well, good luck to you with the war on guns that you're going to have to get, even if you can repeal the Second Amendment, even if you can persuade people the Second Amendment has outlived its usefulness. There are going to be lots of people you won't persuade. There are 300 million guns in the country. They're not just going away. Criminals will have access to them. And as Sandy pointed out, a lot of otherwise law-abiding people will become criminals because they will insist on retaining them. People say, well, but that's not what we want, right? We want modest gun controls. That's what I always hear. Probably most people do want just modest gun controls. But if you want modest gun controls, the Second Amendment in court already doesn't stand in your way. Courts have routinely upheld against right-to-bear arms challenges a wide range of modest gun controls. To be sure, those are hard to enact at the federal level and in many states, though not so hard in other states. But that's a political...
The controlling case is D.C. versus Heller, and the best that we got from Scalia was the Second Amendment is not unlimited, and he very, very cleverly worded it that way so that he didn't sound like a gun control person, but he also didn't sound unreasonable. He's extremely clever in the manner in which he did that. So for him to start citing case law, D.C. versus Heller is the controlling case law. The whole argument comes down to there's no point in trying, so fucked. Yeah, that's the thing. That's basically what his argument is going to be, is that there's way too many guns, people aren't going to get them, so we're in the Wild West now, which is what conservatives want. I mean, they think they want that, but they don't really want that. But they want that. They want to live in a world where everyone's got their guns and they're shining their bullets all day long and they get into gunfights on the street and they always win. Because remember, conservatives are so good with their guns that they'll always win a gunfight because they've been in so many gunfights.
Constraint, not a legal constraint. The Second Amendment is not a barrier to the enactment of those gun controls. Some people think it should be, but as a descriptive matter, it actually hasn't been.
I'm so glad that you joined the stream, man.
Well, what's more, if you want modest gun controls, the Second Amendment is your friend, and any attempt to repeal it, that is what your enemy would be.
I'm not trying to repeal the Second Amendment.
All of those people who have been assured,
I'm not
going to take away your guns, if you think people are going to take away your guns, you're just paranoid. if there is indeed a move to repeal the Second Amendment, which I think is the implication of the conclusion that it's outlived its usefulness would be, that would make it all sound like lies and make people worry that indeed that's what's going to happen, that people will be coming for their guns. So if you want modest gun controls, I'm not saying you should, but if you do, you should be arguing that the Second Amendment has not outlived its usefulness. Part of its usefulness, besides self-defense, is precisely the assurance it gives to people that people are not coming for their guns, as so many people, including the President,
Thank you, Eugene
have
Volokh.
assured them.
Thank you.
I used to have more hair.
Stupid advertisement.
I
Sorry
used to have
about
more
that.
color. And I used to have cancer.
I used to have hair too.
And a reminder of what's going on. We are halfway through the opening round of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan.
Oh, whoops, now there's so many guns. We have to militarize the place. Yes. Yes. And you know what happened with that, right? It was the North Hollywood shootout that did that, right? Because in California at the time, they were allowed to have assault rifles with humongous, with 100-round drum magazine capacities. And what did they do? They started shooting at cops. And what did the cops do? What did everyone do? Let's just arm the police. Yep.
And we have four debaters
preaching to
arguing
the
it out
choir
over this
tonight,
motion in
baby.
2 teams of 2. The constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. We have heard 2 of the debaters, and now on to the third. Let's welcome to the lectern Alan Dershowitz. He is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard,
This should be
best-selling
good.
author of 30 books, including Taking the Stand, My Life in the Law. Alan
Thank you.
Dershowitz.
What a great and powerful argument. No wonder he's considered a genius. But let's think about his argument for a minute. The argument was really not so much in favor of the Second Amendment. It was in favor of
Super late. I have to go. Hope to see you in the future. Hey, man, I really
The right of
appreciate
self-
you dropping by the stream, man. Drop by anytime. Make sure to give me a follow on Twitch and a follow on Twitter, man. And even join my Discord, too. I'm trying to expand my Discord channel to get some more action in there, so I appreciate it, man.
self-defense. You are right. We all agree there should be a right of self-defense. So don't you agree with me that it would have been better if the Second Amendment had been written as everybody has the right of self-defense?
And we gotta
Then
follow
we
it.
could argue whether or not guns were necessary, what kinds of guns, what kinds of restrictions. You would also then have to debate whether or not guns were permissible for hunting, because hunting is not part of self-defense. The Second Amendment reads rather differently. It starts out by saying a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state better than the right of the Second Amendment had been written as. So I think everybody would agree that the first clause of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia, has outlived its usefulness. We do not have militias, state militias. They are as anachronistic as the Third Amendment, talking about that we can't quarter troops. Now, that doesn't mean that I would want...
I just mentioned quartering troops earlier in the stream, and so did Dershowitz. But yes, he's right. A well-regulated militia. Where's the well-regulated militias, man? We have a right to them, don't we?
to amend the Bill of Rights. I don't want to amend the Third Amendment. I prefer to leave it there, because if you start amending the Third Amendment, Sandy will have a constitutional convention, and he'll have people who might start amending the First Amendment, and the Fourth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment. So I'm happy to leave all the amendments there, as long as we acknowledge that the Second Amendment, like the Third Amendment, has outlived its usefulness. My point is it would have been so much better if we had established the primary right in the Constitution, the right of self-defense. Then we would have nothing to debate. We would all agree there is a right to self-defense. We would then be able to debate what the derivative right is from the right of self-defense, just like we debate today as to what the derivative right of privacy is from the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their homes and places. But we have to distinguish between the primary right and the secondary right. The primary right should be the right of self-defense. Of course, I throw the question to my distinguished opponents. Are they conceding that the Second Amendment should be interpreted to abolish the right of hunters to own weapons that are useful only in killing animals and are not useful in defending one's home or oneself? Should one have to demonstrate that one is using the weapon for self-defense? Would you rewrite the Second Amendment if you had the choice and abolish the term?
Boom, headshot. This is why you don't debate against someone like Alan Dershowitz. Because when you talk about we need a right to have a gun for self-defense, now you have to prove that what you're doing is for self-defense. Beautiful argument. Beautiful argument.
A well-regulated militia and say instead, quote, the right of self-defense being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall be infringed. It seems to me from Professor Volokh's argument that he would support such an amendment, or at the very least, if he had been a framer of the Constitution, he would have preferred an amendment which started out with the right of self-defense being essential. So I think you've helped defeat your
Hey, Rob. What's going on, man? Welcome to the stream, brother.
own argument by creating a new basic fundamental right and then deriving the right that's in the Constitution from that fundamental right. And so the question remains, what difference
If you're
would
just
it make?
tuning in,
The
Rob,
difference
I'm
is fundamental.
giving my thoughts
I
on
agree with
the
you.
Second Amendment
Basic
and this
rights should
debate
be
on
recognized by
intelligence squared.
constitutions. Virtually every country in the world today recognizes the right of self-defense. 4 countries in the world, Mexico, Guatemala, Haiti, and the United States, I think, recognize the right to bear arms. So the vast majority of countries feel and believe that you can have a right of self-defense without necessarily having a fundamental right to bear arms. It seems to me that that's a relevant consideration. And I agree with my
Yes, I am for more gun control. Definitely for more gun control.
distinguished colleague.
If you'd like to know more specifics, we're going to go over it throughout the stream, or feel free to shoot me any questions, and we'll get this thing going.
That the laboratories of democracy should be allowed to operate. And we should not federalize this constitutional right. We should not be the only leading industrial country in the world that has, as a fundamental right, the right to bear arms. What do the 4 countries that have a right to bear arms have in common? What does Mexico, Guatemala, Haiti, and the United States have in common? They all have extraordinarily high crime rates.
Boom, headshot. I mean, what is there left to say? You've got a nation full of guns, the right to keep them, more guns in circulation, more of a chance that someone's going to use it for something wrong.
Extraordinarily high murder rates, extraordinarily high death rates. I don't want to get into the argument because I agree, all of us would agree here, the statistics cut both ways. You can make arguments in favor of the fact that guns cause death, other arguments that guns prevent death. But look at the reality in a common sense way. Look at the fact that we are a country infested with murder and death and gun injuries and suicide and accidents in the home. It cannot be a coincidence that the easy availability of guns in our country has nothing to do with high murder rates. That just...
I mean, what else is there left to say? At this point, it's mic drop time for Dershowitz. You disagree with me? Okay, great. I'm actually glad that you're here to talk about that. I tend to like talking to people who disagree with me because there's just more action. So
can't be a coincidence. Yes, there are cultural differences. To be sure, Japan is not the United States, England is not the United States. But when you look at the crime rates in those countries and do all the comparisons you want, you can compare inner cities in one country with inner cities in another country, and I know you can get all kind of data to support your conclusions. But at bottom, the question really comes to what kind of society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society where we are forced to defend ourselves by guns, where the more the bad guys get guns, the more the good guys have to arm and get guns? I'm reminded of the great episode from All in the Family where Archie Bunker gets to do an op-ed on television. And he says, the way to solve the problem of airplane hijacking is very simple. Require everybody who gets on an airplane to have a gun. That way, nobody will hijack an airplane. Do you want to get on a plane in which everybody has a gun? And do you want to live in an America where everyone has a gun? If the answer...
thank you. That is my point to AT, and that is the one question that conservatives and gun nuts will not answer is what type of society you want to live in. I touched on it earlier in the stream that I don't want to live in a Wild West world. You know, I don't want to live in Westworld where everyone's got a gun. And you don't want to hijack this plane. Everyone on this plane I don't want everybody to have a gun. And a lot of Republicans up until the late 1980s were not for having all these guns around. They knew that's probably not a good idea. You're from Canada? Right on. Hey, there are conservatives in Canada. It's no biggie. You guys got Lauren Southern up there, so it's all good. Conservatives are welcome in Canada, and they're welcome in my stream too, man.
Answer to that question is no.
What specifically do you disagree with me on, Robert?
Let's acknowledge that the Second Amendment is anachronistic, has outlived its usefulness. Let's not abolish or amend the Second Amendment. Let's construe it reasonably to
Yeah, I believe in your right to protect your family against threats as well, man. I do. I said earlier in the stream I'm not for a full-on gun ban, but I'm definitely for more regulations controlling what guns people can have and who can get them. So I'm in favor of that, but I'm definitely in favor of you defending your family, man.
permit gun control, to limit the ownership of guns to the right of self-defense, perhaps with, here I'm going to go further than you, perhaps also allow hunters to have limited access to guns. That's my position. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan Dershowitz. Our motion is the constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. And here to argue against this motion, David Kopel. He is Research Director at the Independence Institute, an adjunct professor at Denver University Sturm College of Law, and Associate Policy Analyst at the Cato Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Kopel.
Thank you. Thank you. When I'm not in New York City, I spend just about all my waking hours in one particular.
Yeah, and as the stream goes on, I'll continue to lay out some stuff so that way people get to know my perspective on it. So we'll keep going.
Case in a civil rights lawsuit in federal district court in Colorado, where I represent 55 of Colorado's elected sheriffs who were suing against the unconstitutional, extreme, and highly immodest laws pushed down on Colorado by Mr. Bloomberg's successful lobbying last spring. In the United States Supreme Court, I presented briefs on behalf of a very large national coalition of law enforcement organizations in District of Columbia versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago. Included in that coalition are the two organizations of national organizations of police trainers, the police who train the police. My clients, like the vast majority of law enforcement officers, according to every survey of law enforcement officers ever done, strongly support the Second Amendment and oppose laws which make it difficult for law-abiding citizens to own firearms for protection, because they believe that guns in the right hands substantially enhance public safety. What's some of the evidence for this belief? Well, in the United States...
Okay, so I want to say this very clear, that be very wary of what police actually support. Police tend to support policies that give them job security, if you know what I mean. They tend to support things like the three strikes law, because the more authority they have to lock people up, the more the prison industrial complex churns, and the more jobs they need. If there are more people out there with guns, the more guns they have, the more likely they are to find illegal guns. And illegal guns means an arrest. And the more arrests they make, the higher their budgets go. So I tend to take what they say with a grain of salt, what police organizations want. I have this whole, actually trying to write a book about it, about police culture, being a former correctional law enforcement officer. Less government involved, the better. I don't believe we need more registration and more regulations. Yeah, I disagree. I mean, I'm not a big fan of government being involved in everything, but I do believe the government has a right to protect life. I do believe we need police, obviously, and police is government, and regulations are the laws that police have to do their jobs and enforce the law. So I am for government in that aspect, but there are times where the government has to step in and do stuff, just like with drunk driving. There was a drunk driving epidemic. Government had to step in, and there's a lot less drunk driving deaths out there, and there's harsher punishments for it.
When a burglary takes place against a home, 13% of the time, the victims are in the home. That's called a hot burglary or a home invasion burglary. In contrast, in England, the rate of home invasion burglaries is 59%. In the Netherlands, it's 45%. And this is because in the United States, people can lawfully own guns for self-defense in their home and have them readily available for self-defense in an emergency, unlike in those other...
Causation does not equal correlation. I hate it when people try to use that. He's literally citing a statistic that shows the amount of first-degree burglaries in these other nations are higher because they have less gun laws. Maybe there's other factors that are coming into play with these burglaries, but causation does not equal correlation. You cannot figure out what's going on in people's heads why they're doing a crime on a mass scale. It's just impossible. It's like trying to prove why people speed, right? Nobody knows why so many people get speeding tickets. Some people like to drive fast. Some people are in a hurry.
Their nations. Studies of working burglars in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and St. Louis have consistently found that most burglars in the United States work quite hard, spend the largest portion of their working day trying to make sure that there's nobody home because they perceive a very high risk of getting shot if they do come in when somebody is home. And in fact, in the United States, the risk that a burglar will be shot exceeds the risk that he will go to prison. And if you think prison has some deterrent value against burglary, and I certainly do, then home self-defense has an even stronger protective value. The Centers for Disease Control is not a pro-gun propaganda organization. They conducted a national survey in 1994. They found that year there were 503,000 defensive gun uses against burglars, usually in the United States.
503,000 defensive gun uses against burglars. Okay. I talked about this earlier, okay? And I have doubts about the defensive gun use statistics because a lot of them have to do with the fact that you're going off of people's testimony. And just like someone said earlier in chat that, people tell tall tales when it comes to their gun usage. And I don't think those statistics are really reliable because a lot of them are just self-claims.
Without a shot even being fired. And in 99% of those cases, when the victim confronted the burglar decided it was time to leave work early. Now, if you look at when burglaries do happen against victims in the home, they frequently lead to not only a burglary, but to assaults against people in the home. If you simply take our 13% home invasion burglary rate and scale that up to the 45% rate of some other countries, that would lead to an additional 500,000 assaults every year in this country. That by itself would raise the national crime rate by 9%. Guns are not only useful against burglars and for deterring burglars, but for self-defense in general. This summer, the National Research Council and the Institute of Medicine, two federal research centers, at the request of President Obama, put together an expert panel of the leading social scientists on firearms policy issues to provide recommendations for what future topics need to be researched and also on what topics has consensus been achieved among social scientists. What they said in their report was that the social science is clear that when a victim is attacked, using a firearm defensively leads to a lower rate of victim injury, to a lower rate of crime completion than any other protective strategy. It is the safest thing to do for the crime victim on a broad-scale statistical basis. And they also said the social science is clear that guns are used at least for good, lawful defensive purposes, at least as often as they are used for criminal purposes.
Of
course, the benefit to law enforcement of this is enormous. In the fewer victimizations, the fewer crimes, the fewer people they have to respond to and help so they can help other people. Now, why is the Second Amendment necessary today? To protect people from local bigoted governments. It was necessary in the civil rights era when civil rights workers frequently had to arm themselves in the South.
And in the 1960s, the Black Panthers armed themselves against the police who were torturing them and killing them and beating them for no reason. And they started marching in the streets and doing cop watches with guns. And the Republican governor, Ronald Reagan, signed a bill to take their guns away.
For protection against the domestic terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan, when local police were often complicit with the Klan. It's why the Deacons for Defense and Justice were formed in Bogalusa, Louisiana in 1965 to successfully provide armed protection to organizations such as the Congress of Racial Equality. It was necessary in Washington, D.C., where Dick Heller spent every day as an armed guard at the Federal Judicial Center and was not allowed by the D.C. City Council to use any firearm in his home ever for lawful self-defense against a violent home invader. It was necessary in Chicago, where Otis McDonald, a 70-year-old Korean War veteran, received personal death threats from gangsters because of his anti-gang work. And Chicago said, well, you can have a rifle or a shotgun. He knew how to use a rifle. He'd been in the Korean War. But for his condition, in the apartment he lived in, with his physical strength and agility and the current status it was, the handgun was the right choice for him for self-defense. And the bigoted City Council of Chicago would not allow him to use that, and that's why the Second Amendment was necessary. And it's necessary in New York City right now. If you have a handgun permit in New York City, You can go on a trip. You can drive from Brooklyn all the way to Seattle and lawfully carry that gun in your car in every state across the country, and it's a good, secure thing to have in case your car breaks down in the middle of the night someplace on a deserted road. But the New York City Police Department won't let you take the handgun out of the city. There is no rational basis for that prohibition. It is purely for the oppression of gun owners to the detriment of self-defense. It is a dangerous law, and a Second Amendment lawsuit will likely be necessary to remove that. I urge you to vote against this deadly, dangerous proposition, to vote for public safety.
More right-wing propaganda. If you take these away, everyone's going to die. It's just like all the crap they peddle. They always peddle that crap, and I'm not buying it.
Based on the recognition that today the Second Amendment remains vitally necessary to the security of a free state.
Thank you, David Kopel.
Big brains staring into microscopes
Yeah,
is
another
what I
fucking
thought
ad.
the American Cancer Society was.
And that concludes round one of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate, where our motion is the constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. Keep in mind how you voted at the top of the evening. Once again, we're going to have you vote right after the arguments are concluded, and the team whose numbers have changed the most in percentage point terms will be declared our winner. Now on to round two, and round two is where the debaters address one another and take questions from me and from you in the audience. We have two teams of two. The motion is the constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. The team that's arguing for this motion, that it's outlived its usefulness, Sandy Levinson and Alan Dershowitz. We have heard them argue that, number one, they're telling you that they're not here arguing to ban all guns, they're not here arguing to repeal the Second Amendment, but they are arguing that the right to bear arms has no place in the Constitution, that this should be left up to local governments and to states, that judges shouldn't be involved in making these policy decisions. They also are making the argument that the language as written really doesn't talk about a right to self-defense, that the right to bear arms is not the same thing as a right to self-defense, and if we want a right to self-defense, let us put it in the Constitution, but right now it's just not there. The team arguing against the motion, David Kopel and Eugene Volokh, are trying to get you to vote against this motion that the right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. They say the right to self-defense is a basic human right, and so is access to the tools needed to carry out and execute that right. They say clearly that they believe that guns do deliver that self-defense and went through several examples of that. But they also say that it needs to be in the Constitution because there's a bigotry at the local level against gun ownership, and it needs the protection of the constitutional amendment, much in the same way as civil rights have in the past. So that's where the two sides stand on this, basically. And I want to go to the side that's arguing against the motion, trying to convince this audience that the constitutional right to bear arms remains vital, has usefulness, and to bring to you something that your opponent, Alan Dershowitz, said, in which he said, sure, you guys are arguing the right to self-defense. They concede that's a basic human right, but they also insist it's just not there in the language of the Second Amendment. It says right to bear arms, not the right to self-defense, and they say that's a difference. Which of you would like to take that on? Eugene Volokh.
Real quick.
David
The Second Amendment is the right to keep and bear arms. As Heller and McDonald say, it's the right to keep and bear arms for all lawful purposes. Self-defense, hunting, target shooting, whatever. It's not limited to self-defense. Certainly self-defense is the most important purpose of that right under Heller. That's what the Supreme Court said was that the core purpose of the right, but the Supreme Court didn't say that was the only purpose of the right. The right is for all lawful purposes, and modern constitutions, state constitutions, say so more explicitly, but their point is the same as the Second Amendment.
Alan Dershowitz, I think your opponent David Kopel is saying it's pretty obvious that's what everybody means by the right to bear arms.
Oh,
that it's
not
the right
at
to
all.
self-defense.
I think the Second Amendment historically gives the right of the people the right to use guns against their government. As Jefferson said over and over again, we need to have armed citizens in the state to make sure that there are no monarchies trying to take over. It was a right of revolution. There was no debate, as far as I know, about self-defense. It may have been implicit, but the Second Amendment's language, and many of the people who are the strongest supporters of the Second Amendment are literalists. They go to the original understanding. They look at the word.
Yes, absolutely. Most people who are constitutional conservatives are literalists, like Scalia. And what are the first four words? A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The entirety of the Second Amendment is keep and bear arms for people to rebel against their government. That is it. There was nothing about self-defense in there. Any notion that that's what it was intended for is just not true.
Words, why are you prepared to excise
Right to
the
bear
first,
arms,
whatever
right?
it is, 10 words from the Constitution? A well-regulated militia being
How could
necessary
anybody
to
get
the security of a
confused?
free state. Are you prepared to concede that a well-regulated
I
militia
love
is
Family
no
Guy.
longer necessary to the security of a free state?
No.
David Kopel.
You want a revolution.
David Volokh.
But
I'm sorry,
no,
Eugene Volokh.
I want neither. I want neither. I think on this point the court was quite right. That if you look at the way the word militia was understood around the time of the framing, and actually remains a legal definition of the term, although not a common lay definition, militia meant the armed adult, at the time male citizenry, the times being what they were. Well-regulated meant basically well-functioning, well-trained. So really what they were saying is that
Well-functioning,
an
well-trained. So he's saying that well-regulated means well-functioning and well-trained. I don't believe that's what regulated actually stands for. Let's look up the definition of regulated. Do it on my phone so I don't mess up my stream here, since this guy's an idiot. Regulate, control or maintain the rate of speed of so that it operates properly. Nope. Control or supervise, especially by means of rules and regulations. Not well trained and well supervised.
well-functioning citizenry, well-functioning as a body that knows how to use its.
What are my thoughts? My thoughts on the Second Amendment. I do believe the Second Amendment has outlived its usefulness. I do think it's archaic, and I do believe in more gun control. However, I don't believe that the Second Amendment should just be abolished and there should be a massive gun confiscation. I don't believe that that's feasible. But yeah, we'll keep going here. And welcome to the stream, by the way. DSOC. I hope that's how you pronounce your username. Welcome to the stream, and welcome to the stream, DFKGF.
Weapons.
DKV girlfriend.
Is necessary to the security of a free state, and that because of that, and this is a preamble that explains the rationale, or part of the rationale for the right, because of that, the government shouldn't be able to disarm the people.
But
now,
was the point to defend the state or to defend your own home?
The point was both, and that is one of the things that the court, I think, correctly points out.
Alan, here's what you're overlooking. If you read things like Stephen Holbrook's The Founder's Second Amendment and the other intellectual sources, very clearly they understood self-defense against a lone criminal and self-defense against a tyrannical government as the same thing, except the latter was larger in scale. It's all self-defense all the way up, all the way down.
So what does well-regulated mean? What you're trying to do is now say that everybody who owns an individual gun has to be part of a regulated militia. They have to come to the green every day and march and
Yes. Yes. What part of the amendment? Basically, what it boils down to is people who are pro Second Amendment have to ignore the first part of it. They have to ignore the first half of it in order to get what they actually want. I just think incremental steps should be taken. I think we've taken incremental steps over the years. We started in the 1980s. We continued in the early 90s with the Brady Bill and with the assault weapons ban. It's unfortunate that we didn't continue on going further. I think the assault weapons ban was a good foundation of where we should go and to keep going from that point, but we've actually gone backwards. So, we've tried to take incremental steps. We've tried several times, especially since Sandy Hook. You can't get it past this Congress.
Well, but they're not saying that, Alan. They're not saying
No.
that. They're saying, I think what you're saying, and I'm not taking sides, but I just want to bring clarity to it. I think that's a straw dog. I think they're saying that implicit in the fact that if there were a militia, that the guys have the guns in the house and they can also defend their house, and they need to have them to use them, whether the purpose was a militia or not.
But we don't have a well-regulated militia now.
We don't.
We don't have any kind of militia now. So I think you're conceding that the first part of the amendment has outlived its usefulness. We win at least the first half of the debate, right?
David Kopel, and I'd like you to respond to what he just said.
Sure. Thomas Cooley, the greatest constitutional scholar of the latter 19th century, addressed your exact point, and he said that the interpretation you're following would defeat the purpose of the Second Amendment because that would mean the government, by neglecting the militia, could thereby destroy the right to arms. We might have more
bullshit.
public safety if there were
Scare
something to
tactics.
encourage more regulated, well-trained citizen defense patrols, for example, in communities. But that's up to
Like
the
the
government.
Ku Klux Klan.
We can't force them to do that.
Let me bring in
but
Sandy.
the government's neglect does not destroy the underlying right.
Sandy Levinson, I want to return to this issue of the absence of an explicit right to self-defense in the Constitution. You would love to draw up the Constitution over again. You'd like to start all over. And if you did, would you write in, whether it's an amendment or in the body of the Constitution, would you write in a basic right to self-defense?
I would certainly consider it. It makes a lot of sense, but quite obviously, as I suggested in my opening remarks, it's a very, very capacious right. Does it extend to Martha Stewart, a convicted felon? And to me, it seems the answer should be yes. If Martha Stewart had knocked over a bank with a gun, I'm not sure I would say that she preserves her constitutional right to self-defense. What about non-U.S. nationals who live in the United States? Do they not bleed? Do they not have lives that are threatened? And then what about illegal aliens? The Fifth Circuit, as I'm sure Eugene and David both know, split 2-1 on whether or not a federal law that prohibits illegal aliens from possessing guns is constitutional. Their argument was that the point of the original Second Amendment, and I think they're correct. I didn't do adequate justice to Bob Rosencrantz.
Yeah, mass shootings have happened. I mean, we had the mass shooting in 1966, the Charles Whitman shooting, and I think it happened in Texas, where Lyndon Johnson was from while he was president. Mass shootings have happened a lot. They're just happening much more frequently. I mean, when you're looking at mass shootings in terms of death tolls, ever since the Virginia Tech shooting, they've gone up. They keep breaking the record almost every year. The record keeps getting broken. You know, we had the shooting in '84 in the McDonald's in San Diego, San Isidro. So all of a sudden, some people would attribute that to racist current president. No, they've been trying to go after guns. Well, not go after guns. They've been trying to do gun regulations since the 80s. Actually, they did regulations in the 60s when the Black Panthers were trying to march with guns in the streets of Oakland against their tyrannical government in the form of police. So, they had mass shootings while Obama was president. And, I'm not attributing mass shootings to the evil president at all. I think that's incorrect. So, yeah, that part's incorrect.
His initial introduction, I think the historical origins of the Second Amendment really do have to do with citizen militias and organizing to overthrow corrupt governments. And the argument was that an illegal alien isn't part of the American community politically, which is certainly true. That doesn't mean that an illegal alien has no right to self-defense.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms throughout American history has had a self-defense component as well. We see that in the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, which talked about the right of the people to keep it.
Australia has their guns taken away recently. Back in '96, they had a ban on pretty much all guns, and they had a gun buyback program where I think they got about 1/3 of the guns purchased back, but that was a little extreme. Some pretend like that can't or won't happen. It's not going to happen. I think the situation in Australia was a little bit different. The Australian people are a little bit different. They were shocked at the Port Arthur massacre. It was just a, shocking massacre. But, the fear-mongering, I think, that comes from the right, if this is a mass conspiracy to come take your guns, I think most people, I might joke about it on my stream and go, grab those guns. But I don't believe in grabbing those guns, but the whole slippery slope argument that the right tries to make about it's a conspiracy to get your guns, I think that's very I don't think it's true at all.
Bear arms in defense of themselves and the states. Later on, it was more clearly even changed to each citizen in defense of himself
That
and the
wasn't
state.
put in the U.S. Constitution. They knew about that, and they didn't put it in.
But they talked about the right of the people to keep and bear arms. What you're suggesting is that the Second Amendment, you're suggesting the Second Amendment is obsolete in part because the framers used the term keep and bear arms there in a way that's different from the way that it was being commonly used in the coordinate state constitutions of the time. I think you're creating obsolescence of your own making. You're interpreting it in a strange way as saying, well, it wasn't intended to deal with self-defense, and now you're saying it's obsolete. Well, I'm saying it was intended throughout to deal with self-defense. It was also aimed at a means of deterring government tyranny. But the interest in self-defense has been always around. And if you look at court decisions of the early 1800s, all the time, they
But
said,
you're focusing on the wrong words. I'm not denying.
I mean, I don't use slippery slope arguments. I use factual slippery slope arguments, things that have actually happened when it comes to things like the Fourth Amendment and the Patriot Act. And then, of course, that being extended to what Snowden revealed, I do make that argument, but I don't make any slippery slope arguments. Which ones are you referring to that the left uses?
That the right to bear arms might have some current relevance as part of a right of self-defense. What I am arguing is the prelude to the operative words of the amendment clearly have become obsolete, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security. Now, the answer that David gives is you want the deacons of justice to be able to come and have an armed conflict with the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I was in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. The last thing Martin Luther King wanted was to arm the people and the civil rights workers.
Yeah.
He wanted to confront violence with peace.
Yes.
And a well-regulated militia would have included the Ku Klux Klan. They were the citizens.
what I was saying about the Patriot Act was I was responding to a comment that both sides used a slippery slope argument, and if I ever use a slippery slope argument coming from the left, I use it based off of factual slope, not, oh, if this may happen if you do this. I say, no, this is what's going to happen. This is what's already happened because we continue to do this. So media narrative or dem narrative, not you per se. No, I get it. I was just what are some things you think that the left or the Democrats use as a slippery slope argument? I just can't think of one off the top of my head. Is there one that you're specifically thinking about?
They were the ones who were worried about the government taking away their civil right to have a segregated community. And the answer that my opponents give is, if the Ku Klux Klan is armed, then we ought to arm civil rights workers, and let's have a war. I think Martin Luther King gets the better of that argument.
David Kopel, I don't hear them saying that.
I love Alan
or even close
Dershowitz,
to
man.
implying that.
I love the guy.
Even though that was a great moment. But I want to let them
Deacons of
respond to
Justice
it.
doing?
Well, the point is that those who want, the majorities that want to oppress minorities, like the Ku Klux Klan with local police connivance, they're always going to have arms. And I applaud your presence in the South. You perhaps might not have been on the summer march from Mississippi to Memphis, led by Dr. King, where the Deacons for Defense were there, and in fact were providing personal security for Dr. King himself.
All right, I want to move on to it.
And
I want to move on to a
How
slightly.
did that end up for Dr. King? How did that end up for Dr. King? Not very well.
I want to move on
The
to.
availability of a gun.
I'm sorry.
I want to move on to another.
Didn't
I
protect
don't
him.
understand what you're saying. The assassins are going to have the guns. The question is whether people
didn't
ought to
work
be
out
able
for
to have
Officer
guns to defend
King.
themselves
The
as well.
assassins have an easier time getting the guns when they're easily available
How do
in
you propose
society.
making it hard for an assassin in a country? How do you propose making it hard for a political assassin who is willing to throw away the rest of his life, essentially, for his act, making it hard for him to get a gun in a country where there are 300 million guns?
That's the
just
point.
That's the
that there are
point.
300 million
That's the point.
guns. I want to live in a country where there are not 300 million guns.
All right.
So-
Well,
so-
all right, I want to stop this for a
Me
moment.
too. I want
I to stop this. We're starting to turn into a gun control debate here, which is not.
and that's precisely my point, is that we've gone so far deep into this, is that we're almost forced into it, and that's the rights argument. I think quite a few people in chat today have mentioned that.
Precisely what we're doing, what we're trying to focus on, is the function of this power being enshrined in the Constitution or not. And I want to return to that by going to something that Sandy Levinson said, where you basically were telling the other side that they don't really need to have this right enshrined in the Constitution and protected, because the political process, as it is already tilting, I think was the word you used, towards increasing gun rights. And I want you to take 30 seconds to push that point, and then I'd like to hear the response from your opponents, because I think they said the opposite.
90% of the American public, rightly or wrongly, but 90% of the American public thought that the Senate should at least take a vote on enhancing background checks.
Yeah.
It never got to the floor of the Senate. Last night, I think the NRA invited people before the debate to chime in with their views, and I was told before we came out that the current vote is something like 43,000 against the motion, and
I mean, on the Intelligence Squared website.
Yes.
We experienced a blizzard of votes.
Right. And
it's 46,000 against the motion and 700 for the motion.
And the strongest argument for substantive constitutional rights is when you believe that a vulnerable minority is likely to be victimized by what Americans learn to call the tyranny of the majority. Whatever your views are on gun control, at least right now and throughout most of American history, it is so wildly unlikely that however many people own the 300 million guns, because most people who own guns, I think, own multiple guns, that they are comparable to Jehovah's Witnesses, say, or some other vulnerable minority, that they need the special concern of judges basically to make up public policy for the entire country.
Okay, I'd like to hear from David on that, because you raised this point that in fact the constitutional amendment was required as a bulwark against the political process, and your opponent is saying that the winds are blowing so heavily in your direction that that's not necessary.
Constitutional rights are not only for persecuted minorities. I don't think ABC, CBS, the New York Times, and the New York Daily News are comparable to Jehovah's Witnesses either, and it's very important that there be a strong First Amendment to protect them. And in Nebraska, where the right to arms is culturally strong, the Second Amendment is still necessary for exactly one of the issues you raised, the right of legal permanent resident aliens to obtain concealed carry permits to carry handguns for lawful protection as law-abiding American citizens can do. And unfortunately, there are, in this large and diverse country, just about anything that you can say is nationally popular is going to be nationally unpopular with some local group of people who don't celebrate diversity and respect all rights. And in places like New York City and San Francisco and Chicago, with their irrationally extreme anti-gun administrations, absolutely the Second
So, David,
Amendment
what would the United
protect
States look
them.
like without the
Oh
second?
God! So he's attacking the urban centers again, saying, "Hey, it's the same. It's the same people that enact the three strikes law are getting pissed that people are enacting laws to prevent gun violence when these cities are just ravaged with crime." Yeah, once again, scare tactics.
Second Amendment. Everything else being equal, I know it's awkward, but everything else being equal, if the protection weren't there, where would we be in terms of gun ownership in this country?
People in Washington, D.C. would have no right to defend themselves in their home against a violent home intruder. For
Even if they
example.
voted that way. This is interesting. We're
Oh,
hearing an
this was-
argument for diversity that would deny the people of New York the right to show their diversity by saying, we don't want to be like Montana. We would much prefer to have fewer guns. That argument is rejected in the name of diversity.
Diversity is
Yeah. So the people in New York have to live like the people in Montana, because the people in exactly. I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more with that. People, I think that where you live should reflect who you are, and if there's something about where you live that you don't like, that's strong enough to make you to move, just get the fuck out, man. Go live in Montana. Go live in South Dakota. They love their guns there.
not suppressing someone else's rights. That's no part of diversity. Diversity is respecting everyone's human rights fully.
And respecting them from a point of view of the majority prevails when you have different views and different cultures and different societies and different attitudes and different approaches. And if the people of New York City have a different view from your view, why should they not have the right to express that view and have it implemented? Because isn't there a right to a gun-free society as well? Why don't we have that?
Is there a right to
Eugene
blasphemy?
Bullock.
Is there a right to a blasphemy-free society? Is there a right to a
No, because
contraceptive-free
blasphemy doesn't hurt
society?
anybody.
So, but the whole point of individual rights are that they are trumps on
Because, as
majority
Sandy
rule.
Levinson said, you need to have the right to blasphemy, otherwise the Jehovah's Witnesses will be prosecuted. The reason ABC and NBC have the First Amendment rights is we can't distinguish between them and the Jehovah's Witness handing out a leaflet. The basic right belongs to the Jehovah's Witness. The derivative
Let me,
right belongs to ABC.
I want to
That's
bring
the only
Sandy.
reason we have
hold,
these.
hold
You
everyone.
suck.
Sandy
Thanks for
Levinson
the
is
follow,
much
bro.
too polite for this debate, so I'm creating an opening for him, and you're to step through, Sandy.
I'm just a Texan. I think we ought to be aware that there's something strange. Again, what everyone's views are about gun rights in the United States. There's something strange in referring to them as a human right. Because, and here's I think where Alan's point comes home, it really is quite remarkable that among the roughly 190 countries or so that are currently in the UN, there are a grand total of 4 that recognize some kind of constitutionalized right to bear arms, and you discover that the Mexico Constitution allows reasonable regulation. So it may be, I mean, this is, again, a topic for a different sort of conversation, it may be that there is something about American culture that recognizes that it's a right within the United States. It's part of American exceptionalism. That guns are treated much more seriously than anywhere else in the world. But human rights arguments really do have a universalistic overtone. We talk about intervening in foreign countries because they don't recognize human rights. So does David suggest
But aren't
that
they
we
saying,
invade
I just-
one
I
or
get-
another of the 180
Just for clarity on what they
countries?
said, they didn't say that guns are the basic right. They said self-defense is the basic right.
But guns are necessary for self-defense. I think that's what David
Sandy,
said.
Eugene Bullock.
I don't think American rights should be obsolete just because foreign countries don't agree
No,
with
I'm
us. on
talking
that.
about, no, I'm not making that argument. I'm simply talking about nomenclature. That it's one thing to say we in America are committed to certain rights, some of which look very, very odd to the rest of the world. We could talk about hate speech in this context, and you and I both agree that hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. Most countries around the world don't protect hate speech, and they're decent liberal countries who simply have a different understanding of what free speech means. All I'm saying is that an argument based on the particularities of American culture is very different from an argument based on
All
human
right,
rights.
David Copeland, would you like to respond to that?
The United States is unique with its exclusionary rule against illegally seized evidence being used in court. We have much stronger rules against the establishment of religion than most other countries do. But I think the fact that many countries have gone away from what was traditionally their respect for much of their history of the right to arms and of the right of self-defense does not denigrate that right from existing at all as a human right. As the United States Supreme Court said,
So basically what he's saying is that because other countries have wisened up and have decided that it's time to control these guns, that shouldn't denigrate the right. Now, I don't disagree with that, but what he fails to show is that other countries are just doing stuff better than us. I mean, for us to think that America just does everything better, it's just not true. They do it better, and now they're going to make every point to say that how they live is bad in order to support their arguments.
the right to assemble and the right to bear arms are both found wherever civilization
Which countries have
exists.
moved away from the basic right of self-defense?
Oh,
Name a country.
England.
Self-defense? You
In-
mean they
in
haven't
practice.
enacted stand-your-ground laws?
No, it means their gun laws are structured
No.
so there's
I'm
a practical
talking
matter
about
it's impossible.
self-defense. Great Britain common law provides for a fundamental right of self-defense. I challenge you to name one country that has abolished the right of self-defense.
England has gravely restricted it in practice. Fortunately, under intense popular pressure, they had some reforms a couple of years ago which restored some of it, but they have a principle of proportionality.
Of course
So-
they do.
Well,
and
no,
that makes sense.
We had a political assassin recently, Marcus Havoc. Have we had a political assassination recently? Not recently, no. Why?
That's a
it
human
doesn't,
right, too.
Not as it,
Why
not
do
as
you
it
ask
works in
that?
England, because if you're a woman and a guy weighs 200 pounds more than you, was beating you to death with his hands and fists, under English law, you could only fight back with your hands and fists. You couldn't shoot that person because then you, the victim woman, would be escalating.
On the
And
other
in
hand, the
practice, it's
NRA
right of
proposes a
self-defense.
law whereby if you're in your car and can go from 0 to 60 in 1 second, somebody comes over to you with a knife, and you have the option of running away, you have the right to stand your ground, pull out your Uzi, and kill him in cold blood. That's the NRA's position on self-defense. There are absurd NRA positions on self-defense. There are reasonable,
All right.
nuanced, calculated
Again, we're not.
Yeah, I mean, we had Giffords take a bullet in the head. We had the shooting at the congressional baseball game. Yeah. Yeah, we had Kathy Giffords take a shot in the head.
We're not debating.
I prefer the English rule
Again, we're not
to the
debating
Florida
the
rule.
NRA stance on gun control tonight.
Steve
But we are.
Scalise,
This
I think was his
point did
name,
come
right?
up,
The one that got shot at the
in
baseball
terms of the
game.
constitutional issue. I'm speaking now to the side that's arguing that the constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. Your opponent said, well, the Constitution, the amendment may be there, the right to bear arms may be enshrined in the law, but that doesn't mean that you can't limit gun control. That, in fact, the Heller decision specified all sorts of situations.
By the way, Kathy Giffords, a lot of people don't know she's a Blue Dog Democrat out of Tucson, in a state where there is extremely lax gun laws. Dude at a Trump rally tried to take the cop's gun. Whoa, I didn't hear about that. What, recently? Was that recently at a Trump rally? Was he a liberal or a right-wing guy?
Guns in the hands of mentally ill people, felons, etc. That as it is, your hands aren't tied, in fact, to affect gun ownership laws in the United States. And I just want to have you respond to that and then hear what your opponent said in response.
I agree with that. Most Americans, if you poll them, believe A, that there is some kind of fundamental individual right to own firearms, and B, that there ought to be reasonable regulation. So the question is, who ought to decide at the end of the day what counts as reasonable regulation? I believe precisely because there's so much difference, good faith, difference of opinion, that this is, in America of the 21st century, a subject for legislative resolution. You won't like some of the particular solutions, but that's what federalism and political diversity is about. But none of us on this panel is arguing that the state can never, ever limit guns, and at least as a political preference, neither Alan nor I would support in the United States in the 21st century a proposal to ban any and all firearms. But we're talking about reasonable regulation.
Bernie's rhetoric of Medicare for all and stuff like that causes people to shoot people. That's
And who ought to make reasonable regulations.
But they're saying that the existing amendment is not an.
Man who attempted to grab gun at rally wanted to kill Trump. Let's look that up. Attempted assassination of Donald Trump. June 21st, 2016. Michael Stephen Sanford was arrested at a Trump campaign rally. Attempt to seize the pistol of a Vegas Metro cop. It was the presumptive nominee. Sanford, 20-year-old British citizen who had a lengthy history of mental disorder, stated he had wished Trump to kill Trump to prevent him from becoming president. Yeah, he's been released, served 12 months and 1 day's imprisonment. He had a mental breakdown and was sectioned overnight. Yeah, it looks like some crazy guy.
Obstacle to reasonable regulation.
Well, but there's a tension here
You can
because
just take the
for
same
the first
standard or
200 years of our
angle as the
history,
left
the Second
narrative
Amendment
and
really
apply
played
it.
no role in American constitutional.
Okay, so so we're talking about narratives here, okay? If you want to talk about political violence, since 1980, right-wing violence has dominated America. Right-wingers have been more involved in political violence than any other political affiliation. Are there going to be some people on the left that commit violence politically? Yes. Yes. What's the left's body count recently? What's the left's body count? 0. Giffords took a shot in the head. Heather Heyer got ran over. Doesn't make sense. Exactly, yeah. You don't want that guy with the mentally ill to try and grab a cop's gun. No, we were talking about recent narrative related to guns, shootings. Well, I don't really want to get into things like, okay, well, if people are coming after politicians. I mean, you had that guy Caesar Sayoc who was planting bombs, and all of the Democratic candidates have a bomb day, right? People were joking about that. So we can go back and forth, but the statistics are clear. Right-wingers have perpetuated more violence since 1980 in the United States. That's a clear statistic. Cherry picking contest? It's not a cherry picking contest. It's facts, bro. It's facts, bro. And they don't care about your feelings, as Bench Pyro would say.
It's only been in the last 6 or 7 years that it's played any role. So the debate, in part, is, well, should the Second Amendment now really be invigorated?
And that hoax hate crime in Chicago. Did anybody die from that hoax hate crime in Chicago? Yeah, was that horrible? Yeah, it was horrible. Dude's an asshole for doing that. Anybody die from that? No, nobody died from that. Did he plant bombs? No. All right, D-Sock, man, thanks for stopping by and thanks for the follow, man. Stay tuned for more content in the evenings.
So that 5-4 majorities of the Supreme Court will decide whether or not Martha Stewart should be able to have a gun for self-defense. And it appears, although Justice Scalia didn't offer even an iota of a reason, that he said, no, she doesn't get it. Or do you want these, say, hashed out? Either the Second Amendment really has some genuine bite
I do
to
know
it,
the penalty for hate
or
crimes.
it's an expressive aspect of the Constitution,
All right.
as it was for roughly the first 200 years of our history.
I want to give Eugene Bullock a chance to respond, but after that, I'm going to come
It's
to
not
questions
death.
for you in the audience.
They
And the
don't
way that will work is
execute
just raise your
people for
hand.
a simple
I'll call
hate
on you.
crime.
Well, a
They
microphone
may
will be brought to
execute
you.
people
We'll
for
ask you to wait till the
murder
mic reaches you so
with
that the radio
a
broadcast,
aggravated
both
circumstance
listeners
of a
and the
hate
live stream
crime,
can hear
but
you.
no.
I'll ask you to state your name, and I'll ask you to ask a question that's focused on the topic.
All I mean is
So
his
let me answer Sandy's
claim
point.
was
We're
hate
also talking to me
crime
about the
was
background
committed.
checks
Okay,
failing,
and
in the Senate.
where are the body counts?
My colleague Adam Winkler at
Where are the
UC
body
Law School, I
counts?
don't think anybody would think is a hardcore NRA supporting Second Amendment maximalist, I think made a very good argument that the thing that probably most defeated background checks was the proposed ban on the so-called assault weapons, which are semi-automatic weapons that are really functionally not much different than other kinds of weapons, but they were singled out for specific prohibition. He said that poison.
Okay, let me just shut down what this guy's saying right now. So I'm going to give you guys a quick background as to who I am. I'm a former corrections officer. I was trained on the Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle, and the point he's trying to make here is that semi-automatic rifles, no matter what, all pretty much fire the same. That is not true. At one point, we did start training on the AR-15 rifle. We were planning on switching. That hasn't come in yet, but we started taking courses on it. The difference between a semi-automatic rifle without a pistol grip and a semi-automatic rifle with a pistol grip is tremendous. You have so much better lateral movement on any firearm with a pistol grip. Shotgun with a pistol grip, rifle with a pistol grip. So I want to shut down what this guy's saying preemptively, because it's just going to be bullshit, and I'm tired of people saying that about guns. It's that, oh yeah, there's no difference between a Mini 14 and an AR-15. Yeah, there's a big difference in practicality in terms of being able to shoot laterally, and that's how guys like the Sandy Hook shooter, he was able to just spray across the classroom and light up a classroom full of first graders. All I mean is his claims. So is that not potential for falsifying on an innocent person, false imprisonment, or whatever penalty for hate crime? It's not as bad as death, bro. I mean, it's not as bad as death, man. I mean, is it bad? Yes, it's horrible. It shouldn't happen, and the guy should be arrested for that and should face the maximum penalty for trying to pull off a hoax hate crime. But the guy that ran over Heather Heyer in Charlottesville did worse. He did worse.
In the well. That after assuring people, oh, we're not going to come to take our guns, people say, well, they are coming to take our guns. And that caused people to dig in. You're talking about the functions of individual rights. One of the functions of individual rights is to provide enough of a detente in these kinds of social battles, especially culture war battles, that a side could say, look, we're confident enough they're not coming to take our guns, that if what is on the table is a background check, it might pass, just as it has passed in the past. It passed in the early 90s. So that's actually one advantage that the Second Amendment, securing an individual right, but more specifically, the questioner called is about the right to bear arms, specifically the right to bear arms being recognized as an individual right provides. If that were called into question, if that were repealed, or people would say, well, we would repeal it if it weren't for our better political sensibilities, that...
One person shot or dying is one too many, as you know. Yeah, what's your point?
That's the sort of thing that would poison the well further. So if you want to actually get a background check passed, you're much better off with a Second Amendment respected and firmly recognized as part of our Constitution than questioned and said to be something that's ripe for repeal.
Let's go to some questions from the audience.
We were just attacked.
God damn it.
That's right. About 4 a.m., the printing press of our Hong Kong edition was visited.
The audience, and right there on the end. Oh, let me just say one thing, because I need to do this for the radio broadcast, and I appreciate you waiting a second. Tonight's debate is being broadcast worldwide on our website.
But who would have been arrested for that crime? It's not like they specifically tied one suspect to that crime. It wasn't like they framed somebody. They just perpetuated a hoax crime. Or one person falls in prison, which is similar to dying. It's not similar to dying. Being arrested is not similar. It's being arrested and put in jail sucks. But it's not similar to dying.
Site IQ2us.org and on fora.tv. And if you're actually watching
Don't
live
really
stream,
know
we'll
where
hear
you're
from you
going
too
with this,
during
bro.
this part of the debate. You can send us questions on Twitter or Facebook with the hashtag #GunsDebate, so we won't miss it. And be sure to include your city, state, and your first name at least. And I want to remind you that we're in the question and answer section of this Intelligence Squared US debate. I'm John Donvan, your moderator. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, debating this motion: the constitutional right to bear arms has outlived its usefulness. We're going to audience questions.
Thank you. This question is for those arguing against the motion. We talked about self-defense being a great spectrum from against personal security and also against the tyranny of the government. And we're also talking about how the Second Amendment in some circumstances is anachronistic. Can you let me know what it looks like today in the 21st century for someone to defend themselves with arms against the tyranny of the government?
Yeah.
David Koval.
Yeah.
Well, to start with, it's normal defensive uses when you happen to be in a neighborhood that is politically powerless.
A somewhat modern example of citizens taking arms against the tyranny of their government, as I said before, was the Black Panthers taking up arms to defend their homes in Oakland and their streets in Oakland from the tyrannical Oakland Police Department that was murdering and beating them for no reason. It doesn't matter who, if we already know people are in prison falsely all the time. What? Rare, but it happens. Yeah, people are falsely imprisoned. Yeah, quite often. Yeah, it sucks, but it's not death, man. But I don't really understand where you're going with this. I think we're kind of losing track here.
In Chicago, like a lot of places, there are some neighborhoods that have a very strong police presence and a strong deterrent effect, and there are other neighborhoods that, for whatever reasons, get essentially very little protection. And when the government steps aside so that the rapists and thugs can do to you as they will, that is a form of, at least, of misgovernment. So people being able to protect themselves matters there. And you can look at, now in the United States, fortunately, we don't need to protect ourselves against government in the sense that
back
we're living in
around on
1776.
tyrannical
But you can
local
look around the world
governments.
at the various tyrannies that exist, and people sometimes using guns successfully to protect themselves. Now, I'd point out, every genocidal government of the last century has assiduously disarmed the intended victims of genocide beforehand. And you can say, oh, well, if you have a handgun, what's good is that going to do you against a tank? Well, they take the view, and they're the ones who are carrying out the genocide, they take the view that if there is any resistance, if even one of our, out of 100 of our secret police who are putting people on cattle cars gets shot, that could really mess up our genocide program.
David, let me interrupt you a second, because I feel that you may be...
Yeah, that's more fear-mongering.
Not fully. No, I'm not saying that to be disrespectful.
If you
because
take
part of
away
the
all our
question
guns,
you
then
answered,
we'll
which was
be
the question related to
genocided.
Where in the modern world in the United States would there be a militia resisting
More right-wing
its
bullshit.
government? And you described a situation in which the government was absent, and so it fulfilled the function the government wasn't doing. But you asked a different question. Is there a scenario you see in this country, I think, in this country, where you would need to take up arms against that absent police force or any other force that represents the established government?
Not presently, but nobody in the United States in 1760 thought they'd have to be fighting the British 15 years later, and no sane person in Germany in 1930 thought that the country would within 30 years fall into the hands of genocidal maniacs.
Well, how do you explain the fact that the highest ratio of opposition to free availability of guns are in the communities that have been subject to genocide? The Jewish community, the African American community, and other communities that have been subject to genocide are the ones that are most opposed to vigilante people in America having guns. There must be either you're smarter than they are, or their self-interest is correct and you're wrong about genocide.
You are stereotyping those people. There's far more diversity.
I'm counting
There's far.
I'm polling them. I'm saying majority opinions.
If you look at the public opinion polls of the black community, they support gun ownership as a principle. They support the Second Amendment, and they actually have a favorable
At
view
a much
of the
lower
National Rifle
ratio than
Association.
white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right?
Blah blah blah. The point is,
Blah,
Now
blah,
that's
blah. He just won. Dershowitz just won that argument by just saying, "Oh, blah blah blah." Yeah, that is him conceding.
That's an intelligent response.
So your point is blacks are pro-NRA, but they're not as pro-NRA as white people, and therefore what?
Therefore, it seems to me people know their own self-interest, and if you look at the ratio of people in various ethnic groups, I'm not stereotyping, as I say, I'm polling, you see that gun ownership favorability depends a great deal on cultural background, on background, historical background, and the very people that have been most subject to genocide are the very same people generally.
So here comes my controversial theory on when it comes to guns here, especially in America. Okay, as Dershowitz has so intelligently pointed out, is that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population, which is the majority in the United States of America, is a very fearful population. They arm themselves to the teeth because they think that the big bad black man or the big bad Mexican man is going to come and rob them and kill them. And it also comes down to culture where you live. You live in Nebraska, you're probably going to be a hunter and you're going to have guns around and things of that nature. Whereas if you live in other parts of the country, you've got other things to do, other things to keep you busy other than just have guns around. So, yeah.
That seem to have a lower...
Simply or try, half the country thinks the First Amendment is outlined and we need press control. Well, I don't know about I don't know about people thinking we need press control. I think that there's a substantive amount of Trump's base that thinks the press is lying and shouldn't do certain things. I agree with you on that perspective. The other half thinks the Second Amendment needs to be controlled. I don't think the Second Amendment needs to be controlled. I think it needs to be enforced as a well-regulated militia. I think it needs to be enforced as I think our militias need to be out there instead of people armed to the teeth.
Which has what to do with our motion?
Yeah. Can I?
No, I'm not.
It has to do with his point about genocide.
What does your point have to do with our motion?
Can I offer a slightly different perspective? I actually, and this is directly related to the motion, I'm not sure to what extent today private gun ownership in a country like America would be effective in stopping government tyranny. I think there are plausible arguments that by making tyranny more costly, it may make it less likely, even if ultimately they got super tyrannical, they could crush all opposition. Plausible arguments to the country. But the call of the question, recall, is whether the right to keep and bear arms has become obsolete. What I'm saying is there were...
Okay, I'm going to crush the tyranny argument right now. Right now I have a cell phone, okay, in my hand. I'm also on a computer. This cell phone has a microphone attached to it along with a camera and a signal for data and for mobile calling and text messaging. As Edward Snowden pointed out, right now the government could be snooping in and listening to everything that I'm saying right now in my room. However, of course, I'm live streaming. They're going to know who has the guns. They're going to beat us technology-wise. They'll shut down our power. They'll do everything they can, and then they'll hit us with drones. So this notion that your AR-15 is going to help you, if you really want to beat the government, you need to have tanks, and you need to have drones, and you need to have hackers hacking the government system so they can't nail us. Simple as that.
Used to be two main functions, one deterrence of government tyranny and one assurance of self-defense. It's possible that today the first function is not really achievable, but the second function is very much out there. I don't see the right as having become obsolete if one aspect of it, given changes in the structure of the military and the security apparatus and changes in modern weaponry, if that function is no longer usable, I'm not sure, but it may very well not be.
All right.
The other
I want to bring
function
up another question. Right down. Very, very briefly, because I want to
I
get
think
more
we're
questions.
dancing around the
Sandy
fact
Levinson.
that there are at least thousands and maybe even a couple of million Americans who believe we do live in a tyranny and who are organized in militia movements, and all of the focus on self-defense and the idea that the Second Amendment, the original Second Amendment, is historically anachronistic with regard to, oh, everybody believes that the current United States is just wonderful. There are some people, I don't agree with them in terms of their own politics, but there are some people who don't think it's wonderful and who want to drill and know how to use arms against the possibility of engaging in armed revolt. Now, do you support that as a protected Second Amendment right? That should be constitutional.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Eugene,
that's
take
an
15
interesting
seconds
question.
on this. Or,
I'm sorry.
and
The
clock is running.
right to drill?
militias.
I think probably would be. I mean, if it's
The
actually a
militia?
conspiracy, if it's a conspiracy to actually engage in revolution, no.
No, just to drill.
Ma'am, why don't you stand up? Yep.
Probably.
You're wearing a button. That makes me nervous. There, Michael, come down this side. Sorry. If you can tell us your name, or at least your first name.
Yes, hello, my name is Leah, and I have a question for all of you, really, is why do you think the Second Amendment was intended to protect the rights of Americans to rise up against a tyrannical government when Article 1 in the Constitution allows armed citizens and militias to suppress insurrections, not to cause them? The Constitution defines treason as levying war against the government in Article 3.
I'm going to stop you there because you had a question mark after the first part.
I did.
You know, I think there's a deceptively easy
Sandy
answer to your
Levinson.
question. The 1787 Constitution did not include the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, as Alan would emphasize, is part of the Bill of Rights that were added in 1791 at the behest of people who really were very suspicious of this new national government that was created by the Constitution. And one could quote Emerson or Walt Whitman that the Constitution contains contradictions. And you have put your finger on a very key contradiction.
Do you disagree enough with that to want to argue it, David Cole?
Supreme Court.
So it's okay to control the Second Amendment, but don't worry about First Amendment misuse. Well, the misuse of the First Amendment doesn't have the ramifications of misuse of the Second Amendment. I think that's the whole point of gun control, is that if you misuse the press, how bad can it really be than taking a bullet in the neck? I just don't see it. But there's not much misuse of the First Amendment that I can really think of in terms of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. I mean, you can have issues with violence and freedom of assembly, or you can have issues with libel in the First Amendment and the freedom of speech. And then you talk about freedom of religion. I'm not a real big religious person. I think religious organizations cause a lot of problems as well. But having issues with guns is a bigger issue. We use the First Amendment to take down the Second Amendment. Exactly. Just as Jim Jeffries says, my First Amendment right gives me the right to say that the Second Amendment sucks. Yeah, exactly. Libel and slander exist. But if I slander you in the press, is it worse than me shooting you? I mean, apples and oranges here, bro. Apples and we're not. You're not even in the same ballpark. It's not even the same sport. Come on, man.
Court Justice Story would disagree that there was a contradiction there, as he explained in his treatises. An insurrection is an illegitimate violent action against the government. But if the Second Amendment militias, led by their state governments, were ever necessary to overthrow a tyranny, that would not be an insurrection.
Like the Civil War.
That would be
like the Civil War, right?
Let me talk, please. That would be a restoration of constitutional order. That's what Justice Story's viewpoint is. It would be a dictatorship that was the insurrection, that was lawless, that was at war with the Constitution
So was the
itself.
Civil War legitimate?
Well, if you want to talk about controlling the narrative, I mean, we've all seen with the Russian hack that the narrative isn't CNN and MSNBC anymore. It's what we're getting on our Facebook feeds.
Hang on.
not.
David, are you done?
Yes.
Okay. David, Alan, please.
Was the Civil War legitimate? Or was it a legitimate insurrection or an illegal insurrection?
I have an answer to that. Which Civil War? Do you mean the Civil War against the federal government, or the Civil War that was fought between 1775 and 1781
No,
in
the
the
one
U.S.?
that we all refer to
So
the
the
Civil
answer
War
is
with a
we
capital T, a capital C, and
So-
a capital W, a guy
so
involving Abraham Lincoln. Remember that one?
So the
was that
answer-
a legitimate insurrection? That
So
was
the-
led by state militias.
So the answer is
Someone help
that
me
we
out here
think
with
the
the question.
Revolutionary War was legitimate, partly because we were the ones on the winning side, but partly because we think it was a just insurrection. That we think the Civil War is legitimate because it was an unjust insurrection. But to return to your question, it's an excellent question. But if you look at the framing era documents and the post-framing documents, and for that matter, the pre-framing documents, William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, it was understood that while obviously every government must be able to suppress revolutions against it, and it will, whether it's a tyrannical government or not, one merit that was seen at the time, again, I'm skeptical about it today, but was without question historically seen at the time in an armed citizenry, is it would preferably deter tyranny and, if necessary, overthrow it, recognizing that if it failed, it'd all be hanged for treason. That was understood.
All right, sir.
My name is John Donahue. I thought I heard David Koppel say that you were more likely to be shot as a burglar than to go to prison, which must be wildly off because tens of thousands of burglars are in prison and very few people are actually shot by homeowners. But my question goes...
another one of those things that the right likes to perpetuate. They had to come up with that defensive gun use statistic, that DGU statistic that's wildly inflated, whereas less than a dozen cases a year of someone shooting a burglar in their own home actually happens. Like I said, you're more likely to turn that gun on yourself or a family member than you are to kill a burglar. But hey, go ahead and spend all your money and all your energy and all your resources to stock up your safe full of guns to prevent that from happening. You're only wasting time and money.
To the issue of anachronism in light of the experience of other countries similar to the United States. So, for example, Australia, after experiencing...
Sir, I just want to ask you to zoom in on your question.
Yeah. So to focus on Australia, in 1996, they had experienced a horrific mass murder, and 12 days later, they decided to abolish all semi-automatic weapons and to abolish the right to use guns.
Sir, I'm sorry. I
for
just by the rules. I
self-defense.
need you to not too much premise and just get to the question, please.
Okay. So the question is, why, in light of the fact that their murder rate has dropped substantially since that time and is now about 1/4 or 1/5 the rate of the murder rate in the United States, do you parade these horribles as emanating from removing the Second Amendment if it seems as though the Second Amendment operates more in the way that Alan Dershowitz has suggested as an impediment to avoiding homicide?
My concern with that question is I think that one of the debaters here said there's always going to be evidence on both sides on the impact, and that we would just get into descending studies.
Well, the question
and
was
it would be a
asked,
wash.
you know, I think
Well, no,
that
because we have other things that we want to get onto. So I would like to move on to them.
Well,
So
I just want to say for the record, I'm not sure that the factual assertions behind
that's
that
exactly right, and these guys will say it is, and you'll have studies, and nobody here has read them. Sir, you were with us before, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
How old were you last year?
12.
You were 12 last year?
Well, 13, I think. I don't
All right.
remember exactly
You
what it
asked
was.
you did a great question at on our Israel debate, and you're with collegiate school, right?
Yes.
This whole row. Welcome to our
Yes.
debate, guys. Thanks for coming. So you have to be as good as you were last year when you were 12.
Okay, so my question is for the people who are arguing against the motion. And my question is, I think I've noted, there's something that I'm a little unsure of in your argument that I think is a bit of a contradiction. You've argued that you're not going to be able to successfully impede the ability of criminals to gain weapons. You used Martin Luther King being politically assassinated as an example of that. Yet, you've also sort of stated that...
Hey, just because you're 14 doesn't mean you have to zoom in on, you can't zoom in on a question,
Okay.
so go for it.
Let's see, how will having political assassins not be able to access guns be related to people able to defend themselves against burglars in their home? If a burglar is able to get a gun, isn't that something a bit different than a political assassin who's willing to throw away their life? And so this sort of self-defense situation.
Very quickly, David Copel.
As your question recognizes, there's a wide variety of criminals with different intensities of motivation. And so a political assassin is sort of at the top of the scale in terms of long-term planning. And you can have other criminals who are much more casual. So one of the anti-gun control arguments is what you're referring to, the futility thesis, that nothing you do is ever going to stop criminals from having guns. And that is true for many criminals who are determined to get guns. Can you, at the margins of 1% or 5%, delay when they get the gun? Or can you also have laws that say, well, we can't really shut down the black market, but we can say that if you're a convicted felon for a genuinely violent crime and you're found carrying a gun, that there's going to be a severe sentence, and the studies do show that has some deterrent effect on them carrying guns. So I think you're right. You can at the margins help
again,
on
these
that.
questions are. I'm sorry to be a stickler about this, but we'll wander all over, and you're going to have to vote on this amendment language shortly, and that's why I'm trying to keep the questions focused on that. So, sir, I hope you're going to deliver for
I'll
me.
do a couple more questions, and we'll
it's a
call
tough
it a
one, but I don't
stream
think it's
here.
particularly easy to frame
It's getting kind of late. It's 1:30 on my time.
I have a question to David and Eugene. So if you guys were to write a constitution from scratch, what words would you put in place of the Second Amendment to properly
That's a good one.
represent?
This is a good question.
Great question. And how language that you could come up with that would defend against these guys and give you what you want. Who would like to take that, David?
I think
Or
Gene's
Eugene?
about to give you a quote, but the short answer is modern state constitutions say it in modern language. And so any one of those recent ones, Wisconsin, for example.
My response was dismissive, not that I intended that. Told someone that getting shot in the neck is very bad. Well, what I said was that getting shot in the neck is much worse than being thrown in jail. And, to your argument that the First Amendment being misused is equal to being the Second Amendment being misused, I can't agree with that. I just can't agree with that.
You would take out that whole militia thing.
So let me read to you the 1998 Wisconsin provision, which was backed by then State Senator Russ Feingold. Not exactly the most conservative conservatives. It says, the people have the right to keep and bear arms for security, defense, hunting, recreation, or any other lawful purpose. So that's what Senator Feingold was willing to say. I actually don't think that the preamble today, the militia clause today, is terribly helpful. If I had to rewrite it, and if I wasn't worried about the possible political blowback that might cause even more entrenchment on this issue, I probably would think that...
just when you're turning your head, can you be careful of the mic?
So I probably wouldn't include it, and I actually wouldn't include hunting, recreation, or any other lawful purpose. I think that is something that could be left to the political process. But I think the people have the right to keep and bear arms for security and defense. I think Russell Feingold, that's one of the few things that I'm going to agree with Russell Feingold.
I'd like to see what the other side would say to that. Sandy Levinson.
Two quick things. I like state constitutions and their ability to experiment. One of the things I like about state constitutions is that, with almost no exception, they're all easier to amend than the U.S. Constitution. So if the good people of Wisconsin should decide in the next 10 years that maybe this is too broad, then it's really very easy to amend the Constitution. One of the problems with the United States Constitution is that it's next to impossible to amend, so that we are stuck with a language of 1787 or 1791, which you're happy to jettison, but which does involve, in fact, rewriting the history of the Second Amendment and rewriting what many people thought was the original meaning of the Second Amendment.
Right there, man.
Hi, my name is Stephanie, and I have a question. Does the Second Amendment protect the right to bear unsafe or unregulated firearms as a product? And what is the government's role in ensuring that firearms are safe to use, reduce accidents, and to the misuse of firearm products, especially by young children and by minors? Because when you mentioned Chicago, older kids under the age of 21, young people under the age of 21.
That was a very, very well-focused question. I'm assuming it was to this side, arguing against the motion.
Those things you mentioned are legitimate governmental purposes. And the question, if in pursuit of those legitimate governmental purposes, what are the particular laws which advance them? And do those laws significantly harm the ability of law-abiding people to use guns for lawful purposes? And you can look at different laws on these subjects, and I'd say some fail the test and some pass the test.
And I should just say, not a single Second Amendment decision or decision under any of the 44 state constitutional rights to keep and bear arms contradicts that or undermines the safety issue that you're raising. So if for example, a state court imposes liability because a gun is prone to misfiring or something like that, no constitutional problem. There's an interesting debate as to what the proper regulatory scheme for that is, but the Second Amendment is not an obstacle to those
that's what you
kinds of things.
say, but just remember what David said. David said that he's going to mount a Second Amendment constitutional challenge to New York's law that prevents you from taking your gun out of the state. So there's always the threat, if there's a constitutional amendment, that every regulation will be challenged. The NRA thinks everything is unconstitutional. Locks on guns, safety provisions for guns, making sure guns are stored properly. The NRA can make a constitutional argument against any reasonable regulation. I think everybody has to admit.
Boom, headshot. Alan Dershowitz makes a very good point about the NRA, is that the NRA has become basically a stonewall to any type of gun regulation. So even the people here that have been watching the stream can agree that they're for some regulation. But, the two people against the motion here, the people that are pro-guns, can admit to certain things, but the NRA can't. The NRA's got all the money, and they're the ones that control that narrative. Was it like 700 died to guns in Chicago last year? I assume normal or handguns. Yeah, that's correct. A lot of gang violence in Chicago. A lot of easy access to guns.
Everybody has to admit that if there is a constitutional amendment, the presumption is against regulation. If there is no constitutional amendment, the presumption is in favor of regulation. That's why we ought not to constitutionalize this right. We ought to constitutionalize the right of self-defense, but not the derivative right of gun ownership.
Alan, this is like saying that the Fourth Amendment, the problem with the Fourth Amendment is that every single criminal defendant can try to argue for reading it extra broadly and excluding all the evidence against him, and they do, and they lose. We judge the Fourth Amendment by how it's actually been interpreted rather than by some possibility that maybe it's going to be overinterpreted. The Second Amendment, no, the right...
But the Fourth Amendment is much more specific as to what, probable cause, like not what probable cause is, but is it what can be searched or seized without probable cause. And we've had to adjudicate what probable cause is, but we've had two cases adjudicating the Second Amendment. Presser versus Illinois taking the first half of the Second Amendment, and DC versus Heller taking the latter half. Both sides have money. Yeah, both sides have money, but who's winning? The gun lobbyists are winning. Not one piece of legislation has gone over that impedes guns nationwide. In fact, they've actually shown that gun rights have actually been extended, and that it's become easier to get guns. So who's winning? Multimillionaires complaining about how it's unfair to have billions. What?
keep and bear arms has been around at individual rights since 1776 at the state level.
Said
There are
nobody knew it.
dozens, there
No,
are
you did know
dozens
it.
of court decisions from the 1800s onto the 1900s and into 2000s interpreting it. None of them have had the effect of striking down any such laws.
Sir, could you come down just a few steps so the camera can see you? You're in a little bit of shadow. Just 3 steps. That's great. Thank you.
Name's Eric. So my question is that, so on the campus where Staten Island College now sits was Willowbrook, where the state of New York interned the mentally ill children to die. If we believe that the right of self-defense is to protect vulnerable citizens, which you've all said, and given that in the press, TV news, and even here tonight, we demonize the mentally ill, is it not a violation of the civil rights of the mentally ill to bear arms?
I think it's a legitimate question. That is
Multimillionaires warn Bernie. Okay, Bernie Sanders just became a millionaire by selling a book after the 2016 election was completed. He's not a rich man by most standards. I mean, I think even being a millionaire these days doesn't make you super wealthy rich to where you've got all this power. And I wouldn't say that it's unfair to have billions, but I would say that people who are billionaires do take advantage of the system. And if you don't believe that, then I don't know what to tell you, but that's another debate for another day. Rallying against Bloomberg or Trump's wealth greed. Well, yeah, I mean, American greed has caused a lot of problems in this country.
to say...
Wait, you're saying is it a violation of their right to deny them the ability to bear arms?
I mean, Justice Scalia, without presenting any argument, announced in Heller that just as Martha Stewart could be deprived of her right to self-defense, it apparently was the case that all laws limiting the rights of mentally ill people, a notoriously accordion-like term, could be limited. I presume that all of us agree there are some mentally ill people who shouldn't be allowed close to a gun. I would imagine that as a policy matter, not as a constitutional matter, all of us might well agree that there are some mentally ill people whom we would, in fact, allow to have a gun if we really do take self-defense very seriously. What you might want is legislatures, city councils, et cetera, to write very careful legislation and tell us which is which, rather than to leave this up to judges who, quite frankly, have no training whatsoever in discerning differences of level of mental illness, or have no training in trying to figure out what, if anything, the data actually support.
Would the other side like to respond?
Sandy, that's exactly what Justice Scalia's opinion does, is he basically says that in terms of gun bans for people who are mentally ill, that the Second Amendment, as he interprets it, is not going to intervene, and it's going to be left to the political process. Now, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the main federal law, is a lifetime ban on gun prohibition by anybody who's ever ban on gun possession by anybody who's ever been found to be, in the words of this congressional statute, our laws, mentally defective. I think that is reflected the somewhat prejudices of the time, and I think as Sandy has said, that there are some people, very mentally ill people on the whole, are less violent than the general public. There's also a small subset of them who are dangerously violent and absolutely should be prohibited from possessing guns. But
I think we'll go ahead and end it with that statement. There's not much time left on this, but is there a point that maybe mentally ill people aren't as violent as normal people? Yeah, probably. But I'm not willing to take that chance. So no. So we'll go ahead and close the stream up here, guys. Going to go ahead and wrap things up for the night. I know it's pretty late. Want to thank everybody that tuned in and that's still here. I really appreciate you guys tuning in and listening to my thoughts and ideas and reacting to this debate. I think Dershowitz made some of the strongest points in the debate and really solidified the motion that the constitutional right to keep and bear arms has outlived its usefulness. So please, guys, follow the stream. Follow my Twitch channel, follow my Twitter channel, and join my Discord server. The link is in the panels below. Any last questions or comments you guys have, I'll stick around for just a couple of more minutes here. But yeah, I had a really good time listening to this debate. I think Intelligence Squared Debates does the best stuff. They bring in the best people, and they have a really good structure, and especially when it comes to like having a motion, right? You know, they have a motion that they have to prove and see if they can sway the audience. I mean, it's a small sample size, but still, it's pretty fun. So, yeah. Damn, hour and 43 minutes. Holy shit. Dershowitz said recently that Dems have no evidence for impeachment, no proof. Not yet. Not yet. We'll see. We'll see. I don't know if, like I said, I think when it comes to like Trump's crimes, I think it's just a matter of finding enough evidence to prove them, as opposed to just whether or not they didn't happen. And you know, one of the things that I you know, I kind of come from the Bill Maher school of, you know, if Obama did it, you know, if Obama did what Trump is doing, they'd be calling for his head. I mean, they were calling for Obama's head for wearing a tan suit. They were calling for Obama's head for having Common come to the White House. And after all that Trump's done, they're not going to even consider whether or not we should investigate him. I mean, come on. I mean, here's the thing. If you did nothing wrong, right? This is the Republican argument for the Patriot Act. If you did nothing wrong, there shouldn't be any problem with being investigated, right? If the police want to come investigate me for tax evasion, go right on ahead. I'll give you all my tax returns. There you go. Take a look. Got nothing to hide. Trump's got something to hide. They have to prove high crimes and misdemeanors. High crimes and misdemeanors. Yeah, the whole impeachment stuff is pretty vague in terms of like what a high crime or a misdemeanor is. That's up for interpretation. It's never really been implemented before because we've only legitimately impeached two presidents, Johnson and Clinton. They were in the process of impeaching Nixon. And remember, impeaching a president doesn't remove them from office. It just starts the process of removal. It's like, okay, you've been impeached, now we move on to trial. 2020 is here. How can you find this evidence fast enough? How can you find this evidence fast enough? How can you find it fast enough? I don't really understand the question. I do think that you know, once people start talking is really it. I mean, the majority of Trump's crimes have been committed, you know, without being recorded in any way, shape, or form. You know, the Trump Tower meeting with the Russians, obviously, there's no record of what was actually said because no one was recording that conversation, so we'll never truly know what happened unless people start copying to it. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. I don't know. I think it's a big waste of time. I think the Democrats just focus on beating him in 2020, beating him legitimately. Because if they impeach him and remove him from office, that's going to leave a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. For people that are Trump supporters. If Trump loses legitimately, you know, there's not much they can say. You know, it's not much they can say. They weren't happy that Obama got reelected, but they weren't calling for Obama's head, saying that Obama was elected illegitimately. I'll give him credit on that one. I mean, the election will be here sooner than the impeachment process. I mean, not necessarily. I think Mitch McConnell outlined that they could have the trial done by Christmas. If you think about it, if there's not a lot there, it just depends on what type of roadblocks are there. I don't think you're necessarily wrong. It could take until the election of 2020, or it could be a lot faster. You just don't know. You don't know how in depth the case is going to get, what they're actually going to impeach him on. If it's just going to be the whole Ukraine thing, then that's a very truncated thing with not a lot of records. The problem with the Clinton impeachment, why that dragged on so long, was because of the fact that there was lawsuits that had to be looked at and all this documentation that had to be revealed, and, you know, Clinton had to be deposed and that had to be analyzed and things of that nature. But I am hopeful for 2022. I think there's going to be a big turnout. Just like in 2018, I think 2018 broke some records for turnout. If 2020 breaks records, Trump is gone. But we'll see. You know, I'm always in favor of the incumbent. Whoever the incumbent is in any national race or even statewide race, I always go with the incumbent unless the economy sucks. If the economy sucks, the incumbent loses. So with that, guys, man, thank you guys so much for the stream. This is the first time I've streamed and had a legit audience, so I appreciate that and had some audience interaction. I'll be back for more. I'll try and stream what's tomorrow, Wednesday. I'll try and stream Wednesday. Maybe I'll do a Thanksgiving political stream, what not to talk about. We're going to talk about everything politics and religion on Thanksgiving because that's what we do here. So Marcus signing out. Thank you guys for a great stream.